remember that in my last Stateline segment, I discussed the audacious bid by the small southern New South Wales town of Dalgety to be the nation's capital city, to be the treasure house of a nation's heart. So aggressive was that bid that in August 1904 it resulted in a fully fledged Act of the Australian Parliament, a Seat of Government Act.
But there were immediate problems. As you know, the Australian Constitution stated that the capital had to be in New South Wales. Now what that meant was the New South Wales government had first to cede the land to the Commonwealth. In other words, the New South Wales parliamentarians had the whip hand. The New South Wales government had a right of veto.
The New South Wales Premier during this key period of decision-making in 1904 and beyond was a single-minded and complex individual, Joseph, later Sir Joseph Carruthers, about whom we discovered a little last program. The ink of the Governor-General's signature to the Dalgety Seat of Government Act had hardly had time to dry on the page than Carruthers made clear to the Prime Minister of the day, George Reid, and his successor soon after, affable Alfred Deakin, that he was not happy. For Carruthers, like most of his New South Wales government colleagues, Dalgety, on the same latitude as Nimidabel and Thredbo, was so close to the state of Victoria that it might as well be in that state. And besides, Dalgety was just too bloody cold. The Dalgety option disappeared. Now, it would reappear briefly and potently in the final discussions of 1908, but with the benefit of hindsight, we can say that the Dalgety bid died on the parliamentary tables of Macquarie Street, Sydney in late 1904. The self-interested parliamentarians in the New South Wales Legislative Assembly were only too well aware that the nation's new capital had to be at least 100 miles from Sydney, according to the constitutional requirement, but they didn't want it to be much further away. At least 100 miles was soon interpreted by many of the mother colonies, the mother states' more parochial and vociferous politicians as about 100 miles. No more. With characteristic bluntness, Joseph Carruthers wrote to the Federal Minister for Home Affairs, Dougal Thompson, on the 11th of April 1905, providing him with a list of Dalgety's, as he put it, more prominent disqualifications. The New South Wales government had vetoed the federal government choice. Simple as that. But it was distant Dalgety's sudden eclipse that signalled the beginning of more accessible and amenable Canberra's rise. But why? Why the Canberra region rather than, say, appropriately frosty Armidale or chilly Orange, or even the more southerly and snowy hamlet of Tumut?
In the coming programs, I'll look at the collectively irresistible elements that made up the successful Canberra campaign. But tonight, we look at the local story, that local passion that provided the sure and steady foundation for the Canberra bid.
It was the great fortune of the Canberra-Queanbeyan area in the 1880s, 1890s and into the new century to have as its New South Wales parliamentary representative one Edward William O'Sullivan. O'Sullivan was the member for Queanbeyan for almost 20 years, from 1885 to 1904, during which time he played a productive community role, first in helping to educate the area's citizens about the benefits of a possible federation, and secondly as one of the first colonial public figures to push the Canberra region's suitability as the national capital site. O'Sullivan, and make no mistake, was a great Australian and something of a Renaissance man in his broad cultural interests. One of our country's earliest Republicans, he was also a supporter of the Labor cause, an outspoken advocate for women's suffrage, a keen supporter of the arts, especially women in the arts, a playwright of popular plays such as The Eureka Stockade and Coo-ee. He was a novelist, a theatre lover, a sport lover, and above all, a serial founder of philanthropic organisations and promoter of worthy causes. The Bushman's Bible, Sydney's renowned bulletin magazine, always keen to lop the heads off society's tall poppies, couldn't help but admire O'Sullivan's civic devotion. As one bulletin journalist wrote, "He has helped to run more newspapers, led more political agitations and delivered more democratic exhortations than any other man who ever looked upon the Southern Cross. He is the kind of man whom one would rather be fighting with than against." With his unmistakable look of an ageing prize fighter, O'Sullivan's Queanbeyan constituents wholeheartedly agreed, for they kept returning him as their member to the New South Wales Parliament time after time. When the cagey but impatient Henry Parkes ventured to the Queanbeyan electorate in 1887 to push his own candidate George Thomson against O'Sullivan, Parkes found himself heckled and jostled by a hostile partisan crowd outside Queanbeyan's Protestant Hall, here on Crawford Street, Queanbeyan, and it's now the St Ilia Macedonian Orthodox Church.
O'Sullivan loved the cut and thrust of an electoral campaign, invariably stirring things up at his favourite and the district's favourite gathering place or watering hole, the Cricketers Arms Hotel, built in 1864, a lovely pub that was built just about where I'm standing now. And to get your bearings, we're halfway down the Hall Road, now Victoria Street, and this is where the pub stood. It was known then as One Tree Hill, and it was the social gathering place for Ginninderra village. Now, during an electoral campaign, O'Sullivan tried to time it with a race meeting. The race course was just through that stand of gums here. It was called the One Tree Hill Races. And if O'Sullivan can do it, he had his election campaign and come down from Sydney, and he had it right here in the Cricketers Arms Hotel. All his ardent followers loved it.
After each election victory, he ritually shouted the bar and was soon encouraged to deliver a rousing rendition, not unlike the Australian cricketers today after a test victory, of his signature poem, Advance Australia, with its stirring opening line, "Advance, advance Australia and take thy destined stand," and concluding, "And shout, advance Australia, our own, our native land." At evening's end, at the very social Cricketers Arms in July 1894, according to the Goulburn Evening Penny Post, O'Sullivan treated his audience to a couple of excellent songs, after which he took his departure amid cheers. When O'Sullivan became the Minister for Public Works in the New South Wales State Government in the Federation year of 1901, he was, according to his biographer, the most dynamic force in the government ranks. The Queanbeyan electorate admired him and learned much from him. He, in turn, recognised their political acumen, once memorably referring to his politically engaged constituents as the free selectors, farmers and the intelligent democracy of Queanbeyan. The region was switched on. So much so that when the New South Wales Colonial Premier William Lyon, the generously bearded politician who featured in our last show, when Lyon in 1899 asked the reputable president of the New South Wales Land Appeal Court, Alexander Oliver, to head up a royal commission to analyse the claims of the scattered federal capital leagues, nearly 2 full years before Federation, it was no surprise that the Canberra-Queanbeyan area was raring to go. Only months before the Lyon initiative, Edward O'Sullivan had written a letter to the editor of the Queanbeyan Observer, addressed to his constituents, in which he declared, "There is a splendid chance of having the federal capital in Goulburn or somewhere in the Queanbeyan electorate." Such a bold pronouncement struck a responsive chord with his readers. O'Sullivan could always rely on a cluster of influential supporters in his electorate. Significant locals, such as the man they called the Wizard, James Gillespie, a local sporting columnist and something of a campaign manager for O'Sullivan. Prominent businessman and the first mayor of Queanbeyan, John James Wright.
And this man, John Gale, a colonial politician for a few short years in the late 1880s, but far better known as an author and the editor of the first Queanbeyan Golden Age, the Queanbeyan Age and the Queanbeyan Observer.
This statue of Gale stands proudly on the corner of Low Street and Monero Street in Queanbeyan at the front of the courthouse. It flamboyantly declares him to be the father of Canberra. Well, he wasn't, but he undoubtedly played a creative, facilitating role. For it was Gale who first encouraged O'Sullivan to stand for election in Queanbeyan. And it was Gale who immediately followed up O'Sullivan's success in the 1899 election with a plea to his Observer readers to reject what he termed stultifying provincialism in favour of a higher platform of united Australian nationhood. And it was Gale who, as editor of the Queanbeyan Observer, made strategic use of his newspaper to promote the claims of the Canberra-Queanbeyan area as the very best site for the nation's capital. As his biographer, Susan Mary Withicombe, wrote in the 2001 book Gale Force, Gale took the capital idea and ran with it, none harder. So when Alexander Oliver brought his travelling Royal Commission roadshow to Queanbeyan for a public inquiry into national capital sites on the 11th of June 1900, a number of citizens came forward to provide him with evidence of the area's superior claims. Among them, journalist Theophilus Cox, Theo Cox, farmer Samson Southwell and grazier Frederick Campbell. John Gale too took the opportunity to present his case, making particular mention of the claims for an area around, as it was put, the Canberra Church, by which he meant St John's Church, now in the heart of the capital site. Ever the capable propagandist, Gale also took the public opportunity to heap praise on the merits of his own award-winning grapes and award-winning honey. The Oliver inquiry session in Queanbeyan in June of 1899 proved to be a dramatic catalyst for O'Sullivan's intelligent democracy. Within months, they had begun to shape a compelling case for the area. On the 17th of October 1899, an enthusiastic public meeting was held, as it was stated then, to ventilate our claims to having the federal capital in our neighbourhood. The meeting elected a working committee chaired by the town mayor, Alderman William Pike, which included both O'Sullivan and Gale. Gale took it upon himself in the pages of the Observer to heavily promote the issue throughout October and November 1899. Notably, in one issue, he provided specific detail on the unanimously preferred site of the working committee. And I quote, "The area of 10 miles square of which the Church of St John the Baptist on Canberra Plain forms at once the centre and the most desirable site for the capital city itself." It's a pretty accurate description, you'd have to agree, of Canberra City today. In mid-November 1899, the Observer noted that O'Sullivan had taken it upon himself to bring under the notice of Mr Alexander Oliver the claims of Queanbeyan as a site for the federal capital. Well, this early, determined and sophisticated push by the citizens of Queanbeyan, Canberra, to host the nation's capital ensured that, in the years after Federation, as the battle of the sites raged, the region would always be prominent in discussion. Carruthers and his government disqualified Dalgety at the end of 1904. In the 18 months that followed, the New South Wales Premier went firmly on the front foot, committing his government to investigating quality alternative sites. And he would not brook Commonwealth interference with his task. When Prime Minister Deakin, in July 1905, ventured to taunt Carruthers with the resurrected corpse of Dalgety, Carruthers sent an outraged reply, calling this gesture a breach of the Mother State's good faith and the honourable spirit of the Constitution Compact. Incredibly, in the conclusion to his letter to Deakin of August 1905, Carruthers could even resort to the barely veiled, yet time-honoured threat of secession. Until this question can be answered in the affirmative, there will be a grievance which will sorely strain the loyalty of this state to the Union.
The belligerent Carruthers ultimately got his way, as we will discover in my next Stateline segment in October, sending the cream of the New South Wales Department of Public Works in search of sites. This particularly talented group of individuals, men at the height of their designed professions, soon interpreted the new policy as encouragement to look south, but not too far south.
Pretty soon, everyone wanted to sneak a peek at the fine southern sites around Yass, Queanbeyan, Canberra and Lake George. The visits of the federal politicians to the region sharply increased. Queanbeyan's Federal Capital Site Committee, re-energised and refreshed, quickly got their orientation package together to accommodate this sudden and welcome demand. Arguably the turning point in this process was the winter months of July and August 1906, when Prime Minister Deakin, hitherto a Dalgety man by default, finally began to take notice of the new Canberra kid on the block. And more importantly, it was during this period that the future capital secured its most influential supporter, Labor's first Prime Minister, the debonair and popular Chris Watson. Watson had every reason to stick like glue to Dalgety. After all, the 1904 Seat of Government Act was the only substantial piece of Commonwealth legislation that his beleaguered minority government was able to get passed in its few short months in office. But once Watson came to Canberra and saw Canberra, he was conquered. On the 15th of August 1906, you'll notice that he got the year wrong at the top of the letter. We're all human. Watson wrote to Carruthers alerting the New South Wales Premier to what he now regarded as the best possible national capital site. Some 36 senators and MHRs accepted Carruthers' invitation to inspect a range of southern sites in mid-August, including Marcoolma, Lake George and Canberra. And we'll hear more about that in the next segment. According to one participant on this August 1906 visit, Canberra simply dazzled. Watson was delighted, certain that Canberra was the most beautiful site. In the forthcoming 2 years, a majority of his parliamentary colleagues would agree with him. Canberra's charge, fuelled and fostered by a politically literate Monero Plain citizenry, had begun in earnest.